الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على ختم الأنبياء وإمام الأصفياء وقدوة الأتقياء سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. In our lessons on the Maraqi al-Falah Sharh al-Idah of Imam Ash-Shurunbulali rahimahullah ta'ala, we are continuing to look at the what's going on Twitter? We're live? We are continuing to look at the things that invalidate the prayer. So we stopped at ويفسدها التكبير بنية الانتقال لصلاة أخرى غير صلاته. The prayer is invalidated if one gives takbir to switch to another prayer. This is takbir connected with niyat al-qata'. This is sometimes called niyat al-qata', the intention of ending one's prayer. Right? 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 Why? لِتَحْصِيلِ مَا نَوَاهُ. Because one did what one intended. And what did one intend? To move to a different prayer. And one moved to the other prayer. وَخُرُوجِهِ عَمَّا كَانَ فِيهِ. And one left what one was doing. Right? Right? كالمنفرد إذا نوى الاقتداء. Right? Such as someone praying alone who then intended to pray behind the imam. But what is وَعَكْسِهِ? Right? But this is, for example, someone started praying 2 rak'ahs on their own, the fajr, Fard al-Fajr, and the congregation starts, so give takbir to intend to join the congregation. Right? So there's niyat al-qata', right? Right? وعكسه كمن انتقل بالتكبير من فرض إلى فرض. Or the opposite, if one intended with a takbir to move from one fard to the other. أو نفل وعكسه بنيته. Or the opposite with its intention. وأشرنا إلى أنه لو كبر يريد يعني استئناف عين ما هو فيه من غير تلفظ بالنية لا يفسد. But if you just say Allahu Akbar to intend the same prayer, then you're already in the prayer. So the intention doesn't affect that. Right? Now, if you're praying, the best thing to do, like if you're praying on your own, the best thing to do, give salam with the intention of qata'. So you've left the prayer, and then you give the takbir of entering the next prayer. Right? That's the best thing to do. وَلَوْ وَاقِفًا. Even if standing. Right? So, but if you just give the takbir intending the same, do the same prayer again, but you're in the prayer. إِلَّا أَنْ يَكُونَ مَسْبُوقًا. Unless one is the latecomer, لِاخْتِلَافِ حُكْمِ الْمُنْفَرِدِ وَالْمَسْبُوق. Because of the difference in the rulings between the one praying alone and the latecomer. وَإِذَا لَمْ يَفْسُدْ مَا مَضَى يَلْزَمُهُ الْجُلُوسِ عَلَى مَا هُوَ آخِرُ صَلَاتِهِ بِهِ فإن تركه متعمدا على ما ظنه بطلت صلاته ولا يفسده Did I miss something? ولا يفسده Just hold on. ولا يفسده الجلوس في آخر ما ظن أنه افتتح به وفيه إشارة إلى أن الصائم عن قضاء فرض لو نوى بعد شروعه فيه الشروع في غيره لا يضره. Okay, so if one gives takbir to move to another prayer, then the prayer is broken. If it's another prayer. But if one intends the same prayer, there's no benefit in that deeming to invalidate the prayer. Right? So then what's the issue? إذا لم يفسد ما مضى. If one intended the same prayer, right? So what's the situation? You're praying dhuhr. You're praying poorly. Say, I'm going to do dhuhr again. So say Allahu Akbar. But you're already in dhuhr. Just saying Allahu Akbar wouldn't break the dhuhr there. And the basis is that no, if you're praying poorly, finish the prayer and then pray it again. And that's what from the things understood from the hadith al-Musi'i salatahu. So there you'd have to prostrate in the requisite places. You would have to sit in where the end of your prayer, the original prayer is. If you didn't do that deliberately, following what you imagined, that just by giving takbir you could restart the same prayer, then the prayer would not be valid. Right? There's also indication in this that if a fasting person is doing a qada of a fard, if they intend after beginning qada of the fard, that you intend to start another thing, the other intention does not affect. Right? Hello? Just a sec. Yeah. So then he says ثم قيد بطلان الصلاة فيما ذكره بما إذا حصلت واحدة من هذه المذكورات قبل الجلوس الأخير مقدار التشهد. Right? That if any of these things happens, and there are 12 things that have been mentioned, if they take place before the final sitting to the extent of the tashahhud. Right? So here the outwardly, what is the matan indicate? What is the matan of Nur al-Idah indicating about these 12 issues? If these issues happen before the final sitting, it breaks the prayer. So what's understood from the matan?
It wouldn't break the prayer if it takes place after.
Good. Does he say anything in the matan that indicates the contrary? Is there anything to indicate the contrary in the matan?
No.
Good. Right? So he's my phone. So in the matan, he appears to be taking the position of the sahibain. Right? Right? So this is quite interesting. Right? He says, if these things happen before the final sitting to the extent of the tashahhud. But in the commentary he says, فَتَبْطُلُ بِالْإِتِّفَاقِ. There, if these 12 things happen before the final sitting, the prayer would be invalidated by agreement. And then he breaks it down. أَمَّا إِذَا عَرَضَ الْمُنَافِي قُبَيْلَ السَّلَامِ بعد القعود قَدْرَ التَّشَهُّدِ. He says, as for if this munafi, these preventatives, al-munafi, ma yunafi sihhat as-salat, the things that prevent the validity of the prayer occur, and his expression is precise, rahmatullahi alayhi, right? Before the salam, after the final sitting for the extent of the tashahhud, فالمختار صحة صلاته. Right? Then, if these things happen after the final sitting, then the chosen opinion is صحة الصلاة, that the prayer is sound. لأن الخروج منها بفعل المصلي واجب على الصحيح. Right? So this is this the text that you have, Omar? Pay attention to the text here, please. فالمختار صحة الصلاة لأن الخروج منها بفعل المصلي واجب على الصحيح. Right? So he says that if these things happen before the final sitting, to the extent of the tashahhud, they break the prayer by agreement. But if these 12 things happen after the final sitting, to the extent of the tashahhud, he says فالمختار, here just put an X or whatever, فالمختار صحة الصلاة. The chosen opinion is that the prayer is valid. He says because leaving لأن الخروج منها بفعل المصلي واجب على الصحيح, because leaving the prayer by the action of the one praying is wajib according to the sound opinion. وقيل تفسد, and it is said that it is broken. بناء على ما قيل إنه فرض عند الإمام. Right? And he said it is said that it breaks according to what is said, that it is obligatory to end the prayer with the deliberate action of the one praying. عند الإمام ولا نص عن الإمام, and there is no explicit text from the Imam about this. بل تخريج أبي سعيد البردعي رحمة الله تعالى عليه من الاثني عشرية. Rather, that is the interpretation of Abu Sa'id al-Barda'i, that it is obligatory الخروج بصنع المصلي فرض, that exiting the prayer with the actions of the one praying is فرض. لأن الإمام لما قال بفساد الصلاة فيها لا يكون إلا بترك فرض. So because لأن الإمام, this is the reasoning of Imam al-Barda'i, that the Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Abu Hanifa, when he said that the prayer is invalidated in these, it entails that it would only be by leaving a fard. وَلَمْ يَبْقَ إِلَّا الْخُرُوجِ بِالصُّنْعِ, and nothing remains except, no fard remains except leaving by the deliberate action of the one praying. فحكم يعني البردعي, so Abu Sa'id al-Barda'i said that it is fard لذلك, because of that. Now there's an issue with this, as outwardly stated, which is that these 12 issues, the relied upon position would appear to be that these 12 issues, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, it is agreed upon, the riwayah of Imam Abu Hanifa, these 12 issues break the prayer whether they occur before the final tashahhud or after the final tashahhud. That's number one, right? So what the summary here from Imam al-Shurmbulali is not necessarily entirely accurate. According to Imam Abu Hanifa, if the 12 issues happen even after Because Imam Abu Hanifa transmitted, and he put this here, that the Imam, when he said that the prayer is broken in it, بفلا صلاة فيها ولو, this would be ولو بعد القعود الأخير, even if it's be after the final sitting, for the extent of the tashahhud. That's agreed upon. That al-Barda'i argued that the reason these 12 break the prayer is al-khuruju bi sun' al-musalli fard. You have to exit with your own action. You entered with your own action, you got to exit with your action. And there are of the mutun of the madhab that took that position. Right? The other is, these 12 break the prayer, even if they happen at the end of the prayer. That's the reasoning of al-Karhi, لأن ما غير الصلاة في أوله غير الصلاة في آخره. Because the things that affect the soundness of the prayer in the beginning affect the soundness of the prayer in the end, because you are still within the prayer. So if it happens at the end of the prayer, and all of these issues affect the soundness of the prayer. Seeing tayammum, you lost a condition of the prayer, etc. If you look at the issues, so the relied upon position here of the madhab is that the prayer is invalidated even if these 12 things happen after the final sitting, extent of the tashahhud. Number one. They differed on the reasoning. The Sahibain said the prayer is valid. And that's what he appears to go with in the matan. Correct? Okay. Then he says, وَإِنْدَهُمَا لَيْسَ بِفَرْضٍ. And according to them, this is not fard. And this is لأنه لو كان كذلك لتعين بما هو قربة. Because if it were fard to leave with one's own actions, then one would have to leave the prayer with an act of drawing closer to Allah. وَلَمْ يَتَعَيَّنْ به لصحة الخروج بالكلام. And it's not required to leave with an act of drawing closer, به أي بصنع المصلي. And it's not specifically required to leave with the actions of the one praying. ولم يتعين به أي بما هو قربة. به أي بما هو قربة. And it's not specifically expected to leave with an act if. Because what is a fard? A fard is something that is commanded for you to do. So if leaving the prayer with the action of the morally responsible were obligatory, then you'd have to leave with an act that's an act of obedience to Allah. But it's not specifically required to leave with an action that is قربة, because لا يتقرب إلا لأنه لا فرض إلا. The fard is a ta'a of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if the intention is there. لصحة الخروج بالكلام, because it's valid to leave the prayer with speech. والحدث العمد, or if someone deliberately broke their wudu. فدل على أنه واجب لا فرض. So this indicates that leaving the action, the prayer with one's own, with a deliberate action is wajib, not fard. And there's kalam on this reasoning, right? So I wouldn't take notes from here from Imam Shirmbulali. فإذا عرضت هذه العوارض ولم يبقى عليه الفرض صار كما بعد السلام. So according to Sahibain, if these 12 things happen and no fard remains, your state now is as if you're in the post-salam stage. You just missed a wajib, which is the final salam. وغلط الكرخي البردعية. Imam al-Karhi, غلط is a big word in Arabic. غلط أي نسبه إلى يعني غلط is الخطأ يعني الشديد، يعني ما يفحش من الخطأ، ما يفحش من الخطأ. It's a grave error في تخريجه. So al-Karhi came down really hard on al-Barda'i in this understanding. لعدم تعيين ما هو قربة. Because, there's nothing, because it's not specifically required, according to our Imams, to do something that is qurba, to end the prayer. Right? So, لعدم تعيين ما هو قربة هو السلام. Because even the salam is not required, it's wajib, it's not لعدم تعيين أي على وجه الفرض. وإنما الوجه فيه وجود المغير. Rather, the reasoning is that something that affects ما يغير صحة الصلاة. المغير أي ما يغير صحة الصلاة. What affects the soundness of the prayer, right? Imam Tahtawi explains that out, right? فالأصل أن ما غير الصلاة في أوله غيرها في آخره. The things that affect the fundamental soundness of the prayer in the beginning, like loss of a condition, etc., like these things that we mentioned, affect the soundness of the prayer at the end. Because you didn't leave the prayer. So if they happen within the sanctity of the prayer, they would break it. And he says, وَفِيهِ بَحْث. And this requires research. He admits in Nur al-Idah that this requires research. But his taqreer of this is not quite fully satisfactory. And this is sort of mazallat aqdam. Subhanallah. Here you see in the Maraqi that Maulana al-Shurunbulali, and he is a giant in the madhab on this issue because he summarizes. But there's a few parts that don't fit completely together. But you can see that he is dissatisfied with. So he sees that the way the Imam's position is soundly justified is the opinion of al-Barda'i. But he says that's not sound. He doesn't pay a lot of attention to the Karhi position, and he's not satisfied with Karhi's dismissal of it. So what does he end up choosing? So he wrote a treatise about this later. What is it? Which is significantly later than the Maraqi. Correct? How much later?
6 years or something?
Yes, years later. And only a few years before his death. Like what?
9 years.
9 years before. Yeah. And he chooses their what does he choose?
Okay.
He chooses Barda'i's opinion. But he unpacks the issue better than here, to some extent. But even there are some points, even his treatise on this is not fully satisfactory. Because what remains is, there's several elements. These are 12 issues. There's the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa and the opinion of the Sahibain. Opinion of Abu Hanifa, these 12 issues. Now, if these 12 issues happen before, so there's 12 issues. If they happen before the final sitting, everybody would, the Imam and the Sahibain would agree that they break the prayer. If these 12 issues happen after the final sitting, to the extent of the tashahhud, according to the Imam, they break the prayer. According to the Sahibain, they do not break the prayer. So their opinion is clear, yet that you did the final act, final obligatory act, right? So if something invalidates the prayer, it happened after the final obligatory act, khalas, prayer is done, you left the wajib, so prayer is valid, but you need to repeat it. There are two lines of, now what's the relied upon position in the madhab is the opinion of the Imam, which is that if these 12 things happen after the final sitting, what happens to the prayer? It's invalidated. Okay. So the opinion of the Imam is one about that. If these 12 things happen after the final sitting, it also invalidates the prayer. The ikhtilaf is in the reasoning. Al-Barda'i said, because al-khuruju bi sun'i al-musalli is fard. Al-Karhi said, no, he disagreed with the reasoning, not with the Imam's, what the Imam's position is, which is that لا ما غير الصلاة في أوله غير الصلاة في آخره. What affects the prayer in the beginning affects it in the end. And all of these are all munafi li sihhati salah. All of these 12 things affect the very soundness of the prayer. Most of them relate to the lifting of a condition of the prayer, like the finding water for tayammum, etc. The 12 issues. Right? But also, fiqh is tough. Right? Fiqh is, there's certain things that are, at least the core issues of which you can get down and feel comfortable about. But fiqh, that's why Imam Muhammad al-Hasan said, al-faqih man ghalaba sawabuhu ala khata'i. The faqih is one whose sound opinions predominate above their errors. Right? So, the Masail al-Ithna Ashariya, you see Imam Tahtawi here doesn't really unpack the issue fully. Right? Right? And he quotes a Sayyid Abu Saud a little bit, right? And he says when Imam Shurmullah says فيه بحث, he says that this is why a Sayyid, meaning Abu Saud, said تأييد لما ذكره Abu Sa'id, said this is an implicit support from Imam Shurmullah, or indirect support, that leaving the prayer with the action of the one of the musalli is fard according to the Imam. فيه بحث. But there are issues with Imam Shurmulah's treatise on this issue. Ibn Abdin relied upon Maulana Shurmulah's treatise, and there are issues with what's in there. Most of the madhab, we can summarize most of the madhab. One, the fatwa position is Imam Abu Hanifa's, that the Masail Ithna Ashariya, they happen after the final sitting, it breaks the prayer. There are two lines of reasoning for that. The stronger line of reasoning is Imam al-Karhi's, and this was settled relatively early in the madhab. One of the great giants of the Hanafi madhab, Ad-Dabusi, in his Ta'sis An-Nadhar, discussed this, and he said his famous lines, مَا قَالَهُ أَبُو الْحَسَنِ أَحْسَنِ. And he discusses the issue, but it's a tough work. And this is what's mentioned in most of the shuruh of the madhab, etc. But both lines of reasoning have remained, and you see that in the Kanz, for example. The Kanz lists وَالْخُرُوجُ بِسُنْعِهِ, correct? But on the position of the Sahibain, if one of these 12 things happened at the end of the prayer, what would the prayer would be valid, but what would you have to do? You'd have to repeat the prayer. Why? Because you left the salam. So it'd be sinful, you have to repeat. And then he says, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, وَيُفْسِدُهَا أَيْضًا مَدُّ الْهَمْزَةِ فِي التَّكْبِيرِ. The prayer is invalidated by elongating the hamza in the takbir. وَقَدَّمْنَا الْكَلَامَ عَلَيْهِ. We discussed this before. Someone says, Allahu, that's a question mark. Or, if you say Akbar or Akbar, etc., and we've looked at that in the conditions. People don't usually do that. وَقِرَاءَةُ مَا لَا يَحْفَظُهُ مِن مُصْحَفٍ. Reciting what one hasn't memorized from the mushaf. وَإِن لَمْ يَحْمِلْهُ. Even if one does not carry it. لِلتَّلَقِّي مِنْ غَيْرِهِ. Because one is learning from other than oneself. وَأَمَّا إِذَا كَانَ حَافِظًا لَهُ. But if one had memorized what one is reading from the... Because reading is... Right? Because the idea of the tahrima makes the prayer, makes all actions besides the actions of the prayer itself impermissible. That's the mafhum of the tahrim. That everything not of the actions of the prayer is not permitted. Right? And that's when we took the hadith support. So there's a whole slew of dilalat that enter upon it. Amongst them, إِنَّ صَلَاتَنَا هَذِي لَا يَصْلُحُ فِيهَا شَيْءٌ مِّن كَلَامِ النَّاسِ. This prayer of ours, no human speech befits it. But what is human speech? Human speech is the ibara of the nas. Right? The dilala is لا يصلح فيها شيء من أعمال الناس التي ليست من أعمال الصلاة. That this prayer of ours, no actions of the actions of people is befitting it. Because kalam is, what is that? What is the ma'na of kalam? That it's amalun laysa min a'mal as-salah. It's an action that is not from the actions of the prayer. So all other actions that are not from the actions of the prayer would not be allowed. Speech is avoidable, so even slight speech breaks the prayer. Other actions, a little of them are unavoidable, so they're excused. A lot of them is avoidable, so they would not be, a lot would not be excused. Now, some of the early Hanafis were so strict, and you can see this in Abu Layth al-Samarqandi, for example, but that does not represent the madhab, that even if, he said, if you read something from outside the prayer, and you understood it, it breaks your prayer. And that's not a followable opinion, that one should not follow that unless one reaches high levels of piety, etc., and then go and consult somebody. But reciting something you haven't already memorized from the mushaf without carrying it breaks the prayer. أما إذا كان حافظا له ولم يحمله. But if you'd memorize it and weren't carrying it, فلا تفسد. Then it doesn't break لانتفاء العمل, because that is not amal al-amal ay al-amal al-kathir, because this is not a lot of action. It's not amal kathir, and it's not talaqi, it's not learning, which is a completely independent action. That's the relied upon position of the madhab. The Sahibain had a little bit of nuance on that. Right? Right? But according to the Sahibain, there's karaha, right? Also, the other thing is that they said it doesn't break the prayer, but if you look in Tahtawi, for example, إِلَّا أَنَّهُ يُكْرَهُ فِي الصَّلَاةِ. Right? And they mention one reasoning, because there's tashabbuh. Right? But some people say, well, so they dismiss the tashabbuh, that imitating the kuffar is not disliked in everything, but dismissing one line of reasoning does not lift other lines of reasoning. Right? So there's two things. They made ithbat of karaha and they mention one line of reasoning, but dismissing one line of reasoning does not lift other lines of legal reasoning. Amongst them is that it's amal bila haja, and it's lam yathbut an al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, adam al-thubut an al-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and amal bila haja, wa amal kharij kharij min amal kharij an amal al-salah, etc. There's a number of other potential things. So saying that the karaha according to Sahibain is only conditional, and that they said it's fine, right? That's not confirmed, and that's not confirmed. Okay, so people saying, yeah, you can just follow the opinion of the Sahibain like that. That, you know, and there are people who say that. But people who are authorities in the madhab, and you know, and you can see when I asked Shaykh Hassan, they said, no, that's not. There's multiple aspects to that. One is, just because a line of reasoning is mentioned does not mean that's the only line of reasoning. Right? There are the other meanings of karaha do arise. It's extra action. It leads to extra action. It's an action outside of the prayer, etc. Any questions here?
Can I ask a question about the previous issue?
Let's this issue first.
So it comes in the following chapter that reading and even if one understands or seeks to understand does not invalidate the prayer. So why is it that reading the Quran specifically, let's say there was an ayah on the wall in front of me and I read it and I didn't know it, why is it that would invalidate my prayer, whereas if I were to read some writing in English?
No, but what is qira'ah?
To recite?
Yeah.
Or to read?
So if you read Seekers Guidance Canada, would it not break the prayer?
That would break the prayer.
Yeah, that's qira'ah. Another does not break the prayer. النظر إلى المكتوب في الحائط does not. قراءة is عمل اللسان. Number one.
If someone would...
Right? And which قراءة? The قراءة of the salah. Right? Right? So there's no tasbih. What action? When can you read? When can you recite something from outside the prayer within the prayer? So there's no tasbih fil hukm. Is it clear, Sidi?
So if I'm understanding correctly, it's not the reading the Quran.
Okay, it's not reading, reciting. We're not talking about reading. We're talking about reciting.
So the look and the understanding. When one looks at the Mus'haf and understands it, it's not the understanding that breaks the prayer, it's the action of the tongue afterwards that would break the prayer. Is that correct?
No, the issue, so that's not multiple knots. Al-qira'ah. What does the matan say? The qira'ah from the Mus'haf, right? Why? Because qira'ah has, because there's two things. This is amal kharij as-salah, right? Number one, it's avoidable, it has a meaning of talaqqi, because that's a complete action foreign to the prayer, which is you are reading from a Mus'haf, an action that is avoidable. Right? And it's أعمال من أعمال الصلاة. So, so it has the meaning of al-amal al-kathir. It's a complete standalone action. So it has the meaning of al-amal al-kathir. Whereas noticing something written, there's karaha in it, whatever, especially if it was accompanied by the raising of the gaze, etc. That's not amal kathir. Slight would be, slight action like that would be, have the meaning of karahat tanzih, and a lot of it would have the meaning of abath, and be treated accordingly.
Would this likewise apply to, for example, if hypothetically someone were to have an earphone with a recitation and then mimic the recitation?
Of course, same thing. Especially if one doesn't know it. And then there's other things. Putting on earphones for the prayer, that's, there's a bunch of things. That's mukhalafat al-sunnah.
Last thing I want to ask was,
and that opens other abwab of fasad as well. Right? That's similar to that. That requires fatwa, but there's other karaha in it. Right? There's a question about you wearing noise-cancelling headphones in the prayer to help you concentrate. Shaykh Yahya was asked about that. He was so disgusted, so shaken by the question, he asked me to respond. I said, why do you do it? He said, no, Sidi, you handle these kinds of things. I said, why do you throw your problems at me? I said, because you handle these things. So of course, when I did that, I made sure to send a few people to ask him spiritual questions as a gift instead. Bismillah. So now, there are other opinions that exist. Now, there's one thing. Is there no karaha according to Sahibain? That floats around. You can, don't listen to my opinion on this. If you want to first define what is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa and its reasoning. Number two, what's the position of the Sahibain? Define it nicely. What is its reasoning? And then let's ask. And ask in writing. Ask Shaykh Hassan, ask Shaykh Khalid, maybe ask a few others about that. That would be a good question to ask. We have to stop here. Bi'idhnillah. And we'll continue. Then we've talked about it. The mashayikh differed. Can you what about taking a dispensation for another madhab if it helps you engage in more worship? Some of the ulama are expansive about that. Others say, no, stick to your madhab. Don't do things that are like this. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.
How much memorization